It takes courage to put this down. This is one of the emails that was sent to us, but due to many commitments, we couldn't share the experience at the time. However, with what is happening now, there is an urgent need to share it because it speaks directly to current events and, most importantly, reveals other things that may unfold before our eyes. I repeat, it takes courage to put this out here. Don't panic. Tell us where you are watching from, and please stay until the end so you can become acquainted with what is to come and learn how to keep yourself and your family safe. I will now begin sharing today's experience. I don't know where to start. I have been sitting with this for so long, trying to find the right words. But I don't think there are perfect words for what I am about to tell you. All I know is that what happened to my daughter changed everything for me. It changed the way I wake up in the morning. It changed the way I look at the sky. It changed the way I look at other people, strangers on the street, people in the grocery store, people sitting alone on benches. I look at them differently now. I think about them differently now, and it is all because of what my daughter went through and what she came back and told me. My daughter's name is Ekvis Wilson. She is 23 years old, and she has been sick for most of her life. She was diagnosed when she was 9 years old. The doctors used big words that I had to write down and look up later. And even after I looked them up, I still didn't fully understand. What I understood was that her body was attacking itself, that her immune system, the thing that was supposed to protect her, was confused, and it was fighting against her instead of for her. That is what I understood, and that understanding broke my heart in a way I had never felt before, because I am her mother, and there was nothing I could do to fix it. On the 16th of February, she had an episode that was so severe that the doctors told me, very quietly, very gently, that they did not think she was going to make it. A doctor I had known for years looked me in the eyes with a sadness that he was trying to hide, and he told me that we should prepare ourselves. That is a sentence that no parent should ever have to hear. Prepare ourselves. I didn't even know what that meant. How do you prepare for something like that? How do you prepare to lose the person who made you feel like your life had a reason? I sat in that hospital room for 3 days and 3 nights. I barely ate. I barely slept. I held her hand and I talked to her, even when she couldn't talk back. I told her things I had been meaning to say for years, things I kept putting off because I always thought there would be more time. I told her about the day she was born, how she came into the world crying so loud that the nurse laughed and said she was going to be a fighter. And then, on the 3rd night, something shifted. The machines started screaming. Nurses rushed in. Doctors came running. I was pushed back against the wall and told to stay there. I watched them work on her for what felt like a very long time, and I remember thinking that if she left, I would not know what to do with the rest of my life. But she didn't leave. She came back. Her eyes opened, and she looked at me, and something in her face stopped me where I stood. I had seen her face my whole life. I knew every expression she had, but the look that was on her face in that moment was something I had never seen before. It was not just relief. It was not just the look of someone who had been very sick and was now slightly better. It was something deeper than that, something older, like she had gone somewhere far away and come back carrying something heavy that she was still trying to hold. She didn't speak right away. The doctors came and did their checks, and she let them, and she answered their questions in short, careful words. But when everyone left, and it was just the 2 of us in that room, she turned her head toward me very slowly, and she said, "Mom, I have to tell you something, and I need you to really listen." I pulled my chair close to her bed. I took her hand. I said, "I'm listening, baby. I'm right here." She was quiet for a moment. Her eyes were moving like she was trying to organize something in her mind, like she was trying to find the right place to begin. And then she started talking, and once she started, she didn't stop for a long time. She told me that when the machines started screaming, she felt herself leave, not slowly, suddenly, like a door opening and closing in 1 second. One moment she was in her body, and the next moment she wasn't. And she said the first thing she noticed was that there was no pain. After years and years of living with pain that never fully went away, there was suddenly no pain at all. She said it felt so strange that it was almost uncomfortable, like someone who has been cold for so long that warmth feels wrong at first. She said she was standing somewhere, but she couldn't describe where. There was no floor that she could identify. No walls, no ceiling. There was light, but it didn't come from any one place. It was just everywhere, and it was soft. And for a moment she said she felt completely calm, more calm than she had ever felt in her life. She said that calm lasted maybe a few seconds, and then the first thing appeared. She told me it came slowly, like a picture developing in front of her eyes. At first it was just shapes and colors, dark shapes against a bright sky, and then the shapes became clear, and she saw what they were. She saw soldiers, large groups of them, moving in lines across open land, and behind them came vehicles, heavy military vehicles with thick wheels and metal sides, moving slowly but steadily, like they had all the time in the world and knew exactly where they were going. She said there were planes too, flying low and fast, and the sound they made was not the regular sound of a plane passing overhead. It was a deep, cutting sound that you felt in your chest before you heard it in your ears. She said she could see cities in the distance, and those cities were burning. Not one building, not one neighborhood, whole cities. She said the fires were so large and so widespread that from a distance they looked like the sun was sitting on the ground in multiple places at the same time. The flames reached up higher than she had ever seen. Fire reach, and the smoke that came from those fires was not gray or white. It was black, a heavy rolling black smoke that pushed outward in every direction, covering everything it touched in a dark film that turned the air thick and unbreathable. She said she was taken closer to one of those cities, not physically moved, but her view shifted the way a camera zooms in, and suddenly she was inside it. She was in a street that she said looked like it could have been any street in any American city. There were traffic lights still hanging from wires, though they were dark and not working. There were parked cars, or what had been parked cars, now pushed up onto sidewalks or flipped onto their sides. There were storefronts with their windows gone, the glass spread out on the pavement in pieces so small they looked like sand. She said she walked, or floated, through this street, and she looked into the buildings as she passed them. She said in some of them she could see signs that people had been there recently. Chairs knocked over, food left on tables, half-eaten, bags dropped near doorways. The kind of mess that people leave when they leave in a hurry, when they don't have time to think about what they are taking, only about getting out. But she said what made the street feel most wrong was the quiet. She said she could still hear the distant sound of explosions, a low, constant rumble that came from somewhere far off, like thunder that wouldn't stop. But in that street, among those empty buildings and broken windows, there was a quiet that was not natural. The quiet of a place that used to be full of people and wasn't anymore. Then she saw the people who were still there. Not many, but some, and they were running. Not walking fast, not jogging. Running the full run of someone who is truly afraid. The kind of running where you stop watching, where your feet are going because your eyes are too busy looking behind you. She said they were running in small groups, sometimes just 2 or 3 together, sometimes one person completely alone, and their faces all had the same expression. An expression she said she had never seen on a real human face before, only in movies. And she said she had not understood before that moment that a person's face could actually look that way. Wide eyes, open mouths, every muscle pulled tight. She said it was the face of a person who was no longer thinking about yesterday or tomorrow, who was only in this 1 second, trying to get through it. She said she tried to see what they were running from. She looked in the direction they had come from, back down the street. She said she could see more smoke, more distant fire. She could see what looked like the far edge of a military convoy, vehicles moving through a crossing street several blocks away. But she said none of that fully explained the level of terror on the faces of the people running. She said there was something else in the air, something she could feel but not see, a presence or a weight that was pressing down on everything, and the people running could feel it, and that feeling was at least as frightening to them as the soldiers in the fires. She said she saw a man fall while running. He went down hard on the pavement and stayed there for a second, and the people around him barely slowed. One person reached down and pulled at his arm, got him back to his feet, and they all kept running. She said the man didn't stop to check if he was hurt. He didn't look down at himself. He just ran, because stopping, even for a moment, was not something any of them were willing to do. She said she saw a child, maybe 7 or 8 years old, being carried on a man's back, the child's arms around the man's neck, the child's face over the man's shoulder, looking backward at what they were running from. She said the child's face was not crying. It was past crying. It was still in a way that very young children's faces should not be still, like the child had already understood something that children that age should not have to understand. And then she said something that stayed with me more than almost anything else she told me that night. She said she looked at the windows of the buildings as the people ran past, the dark windows of offices and apartments above street level, and she saw faces in some of those windows, people who had not left, people who were watching from inside. And she said those faces, the watching faces, looked different from the running faces. Not safer, not more peaceful, just different. Like they had made a choice to stay for whatever reason. And they were no longer sure it was the right choice, but it was too late to change it. She said the vision of the war and the running people stayed with her for a long time. She kept seeing different parts of it, different cities, different countries, different groups of soldiers in different uniforms, speaking languages she couldn't understand. She said it all had the feeling of something that had gone too far to be stopped. Like a fire that has spread past the point where any amount of water can bring it back. She said she did not see the beginning of it, only the middle. And the middle was already so large and so deep that she could not see the edges of it. Then that image slowly faded, and she was back in that quiet, lightless place again. She said she stood there for a moment in the stillness, and then the ground appeared beneath her. She told me she looked down and she could see the earth. Actual ground, dry and pale and cracked. Not in one place. Everywhere she looked, as far as she could see, the ground was dry. The kind of dry that happens after a very long time with no rain, where the top layer of soil breaks into pieces and curls up at the edges, like old paper left in the sun. She said there was no grass, there were no plants, just dry, broken earth in every direction. And then the earth began to move. She said it started as a low vibration she could feel through her feet. Then it became a shaking, not the regular short shaking of a small earthquake. A deep, sustained shaking that built slowly and did not stop. She said she looked out across the flat, dry land, and she could see the ground splitting open, not in one line, but in many lines at once. The cracks spreading out from each other the way cracks spread across a windshield when something hits it. Each crack started narrow and grew wide, and from the wide ones she could see a glow coming up from below. An orange and red glow that shifted and moved like something liquid. She said the heat that came up from those cracks was unlike anything she had ever felt. She said it did not feel like standing near a fire. It felt like something below the world was boiling, and the cracks in the ground were the only thing standing between the surface and that boiling, and even those were not going to hold much longer. She said she watched a road that had been built across that flat land. She could see it stretching out in both directions, and she watched it soften. The asphalt, which is already a dark color, began to turn darker and begin to move, the way fat moves in a hot pan. She said the road did not burn. It melted. Slowly and completely. She said she could see the painted lines on the road, the white and yellow lines that divide lanes, melting and spreading and then disappearing into the softening surface. She said a car that had been left on that road sank slowly, its tires going first, then the bottom edge of the doors, the vehicle settling into the melted road, the way something settles into mud. She said she was then moved to a different place, a place where there had recently been a forest. She said she could tell it had been a forest because the trees were still standing, but she said they were wrong. She said the bark of each tree was not burnt on the outside the way trees look after a normal fire. The bark was intact, but through the bark, through the surface of each trunk, she could see a glow. She said each tree was lit from within, orange and red light visible through the outer layer of wood, like someone had placed a lantern inside every tree in the forest and left it burning. She said she put her hand on one of the trees, or she tried to, and she pulled back before she touched it, because the heat coming off the surface was extreme. She said she stood there and watched the trees around her, one by one, begin to collapse. Not fall, the way a healthy tree falls when it's cut. Collapse. Fold in on themselves, turn to a black powder and fall straight down. the shape of a tree becoming a pile of ash on the dry ground below. And then the wind that was moving through that place picked up the ash and spread it. And just like that, a tree that had stood for maybe 100 years was completely gone. She said the air in that forest place tasted of something she could not name. She said it wasn't smoke exactly. It was thicker and stranger. She said breathing it felt like breathing something that was not meant to go into a human body. She said she was then shown cities again, but this time the focus was not on soldiers or fighting. It was on the buildings themselves. She said she was standing in a neighborhood that looked like a regular suburban neighborhood in the United States. Quiet streets, houses with small lawns, a few trees, a stop sign at the corner. And the houses were shaking. She said it was not violent the way it is in the video clips you see after a big earthquake. It was more like a continuous, low trembling, like the ground underneath these houses was so unsettled, so disturbed from deep below, that it couldn't stay still. And the houses above were just responding to what was happening under them. She said she watched a house at the end of the block. She said it was a house that looked like it could belong to anyone, a normal house. And she watched as the trembling got stronger in that particular spot, and the walls of the house began to crack. Long diagonal cracks running from the corners of windows down toward the foundation. She said she heard a sound like something tearing slowly, a deep structural sound, not a crash but a groan. And then one side of the house buckled inward, and the roof over that side came down with it. Not all at once, but in sections, each section pulling the next with it. She said she could hear people inside. She said she heard a woman's voice screaming a name over and over, the name of a child. She said she heard something fall heavily inside the house. She said she heard the screaming stop. She said she could not go in. She could not help. She could only watch. And she said that not being able to help was one of the hardest parts of the whole experience, because she had spent her whole life in situations where she could not fix the thing that needed fixing. And here she was again, watching suffering she could not reach. She said families poured out of other houses on that street. She said they gathered in the road together and looked at each other and looked at the houses and looked at the sky, and nobody seemed to know what to do. She said there were young children among them, some in pajamas, some barefoot, some holding on to toys they had grabbed as they ran out. She said she saw a little boy standing in the middle of the group, holding a stuffed dog, squeezing it against his chest, watching the house at the end of the block, still settling and crumbling. And the look on his face was one that she said she was going to carry with her for the rest of her life. She said she saw those families try to decide which direction to go. She said she could see them talking, pointing in different directions, some people wanting to go one way and some another. She said she watched an older man, maybe a grandfather, try to take charge, pointing firmly down one street with authority, like he knew something. She said the group started moving in that direction. She said she hoped, wherever she was watching from, that the direction he was pointing was the right one. Then the vision shifted again, and this time what appeared before her was a landscape that was dry in a way that was different from the cracked earth she had seen earlier. This was not fresh dryness. This was a dryness that had settled in over a long time. She said the soil was not just dry, it was pale and light, almost white in places. The color of soil that has had all its nutrients pulled out of it. Soil that has nothing left to give. She said she could see where fields had been, long flat stretches of land that had clearly been used for growing things, because she could still see the faint lines where rows of crops had once been planted. But the rows were empty. No plants, no stubs, no roots, just dry, pale, empty rows, going on and on as far as she could see. She said the sky above those empty fields was also pale, not blue, not gray, not any color with depth. A washed-out, faded sky, like a sky that was exhausted. She said the sun was visible in that sky, but it gave very little warmth. She said she stood in those empty fields, and she felt the heat on her skin. But it was not the good heat of a normal sunny day. It was a dry, pulling heat that seemed to take moisture out of everything it touched, rather than give anything back. She said she followed the land to where a river should have been. She could tell it should have been a river because she could see the shape of it in the land, the wide, shallow valley that a river makes over many years, the gentle curve of the banks. But the river was not there. In its place was a riverbed that had been dry for a long time. The mud at the bottom had dried and cracked into shapes, Large, flat pieces of dried mud with gaps between them, the whole surface broken and lifted at the edges. She said she could see stones in the riverbed that would normally be underwater, smooth stones that had been polished by years of water moving over them, now just lying there in the open air, dry and dull. She said she saw people at the riverbed. A group of maybe 15 or 20 people, men and women and children, standing at the edge where the bank sloped down to the dry bottom. She said they were looking at the empty riverbed the way you look at something that you cannot believe you are seeing. One woman walked down the bank and crouched on the dry mud and pressed her hand to the surface of it, as if she was checking whether it was real. She pressed both hands into the cracked mud and held them there. Then she stood up and looked at the group above her, and she didn't say anything, and neither did they. She said she saw people digging. In the dry riverbed, in the dry fields, in the ground near where buildings had been. Digging with shovels, with sticks, with their hands. She said in some places they dug deep and found nothing. In other places they dug and found a little moisture, not water, just dampness in the soil. And she said when they found that dampness, even that small amount, the people around would press close and watch, and the person digging would slow down and be very careful, treating that small patch of damp earth like something valuable and fragile. She said she saw animals too in this dry place. Not many. A few dogs that were very thin, moving slowly along the edge of what had been the riverbank, noses low to the ground. Some birds sitting on the bare branches of a dead tree, not moving, just sitting. She said the animals had the same look that the people had. Not panic, not energy, a quietness that came from having spent too long without enough. She said there were reservoirs she saw, large ones that were meant to hold water for whole cities. She said some of them were completely empty, their concrete bottoms visible and bare and cracked from the sun. Some had a little water left, but only at the very center, a small pool surrounded by a wide ring of dried sediment that showed where the water line used to be, much higher, long ago. She said she saw pipes that had been meant to carry water, now running dry, and she saw valves that had been opened and left open because there was nothing flowing through them to need controlling. She said she saw people lining up, long lines outside buildings that had signs on them, signs she understood to mean these were places distributing water. She said the lines were longer than she could see the end of. She said people in those lines were standing close together, but not talking to each other much. They were holding containers, bottles, buckets, pots, bags, any container that could hold liquid. She said she saw a woman near the front of the line holding what looked like a cooking pot with a lid on it, holding it against her body with both arms like it was a child. She said she watched a commotion break out near the back of one of those lines. She said she couldn't hear clearly what started it, but she saw pushing. She saw people pushing against each other, and then the pushing became something more, and people in the middle of the line were caught in it, and some of them fell. She said people at the front of the line turned to look but didn't move from their spots. She said she understood why. She said she did not judge them for it, because their place in that line was the difference between having something to bring home and having nothing, and they had probably waited a very long time to get where they were. Then she was taken to where the food was, or where it should have been. She said she saw markets, not small corner stores, large markets, the size of the big grocery stores here in the United States, and she said she walked through them, or moved through them, and the shelves were empty, not picked over, the way shelves look after a storm warning when people have bought everything up. She said these were shelves that had been empty for a while. She said the shelves themselves were dusty. She said in some aisles, the shelf labels were still there, the little tags that tell you what the price of something is, still attached to the edge of the shelf below the empty space where the product should have been. She said reading those labels felt strange. Cooking oil, $6.99. Bread, $3.49. Prices for things that no longer existed. She said she saw a group of people walking through one of those empty markets. She said they were walking slowly, in no particular direction, going up one aisle and then the next, looking at the shelves. She said she understood that they knew the shelves were empty. She said it was not as if they expected to find something. She said it seemed more like they were there because they didn't know where else to go, because this was where food had always been, and coming here was a habit, and habits are one of the last things to change even when everything else already has. She said she saw a man stop in front of a shelf that had a single can on it, pushed to the back. She said he reached for it carefully, like he was afraid it would disappear before he could get to it. He looked at it for a long moment, turning it over in his hands, reading the label. Then he looked around him, at the other people in the aisle, and he put the can in the bag he was carrying and walked on quickly. She said nobody moved to stop him. She said a few people watched him go, and she could see the thought on their faces, the thought that they should have checked that shelf first. But what was done was done. She said outside the large empty markets, there were smaller gatherings. People had set up small informal selling spots on the street, blankets spread out on the pavement with a few items on each one, a small pile of vegetables that were not in good condition, dried out and soft, a few tins, some bags of grain. She said the prices she could see on handwritten signs next to these things were very high, higher than made sense for what was being sold, but she said people were buying anyway, or trying to. She said she watched people at one of these street stalls count out money carefully, counting the same bills twice, 3 times, handing over more than it looked like they could afford for a very small amount of food. She said she saw children in this place too. She said children were present in almost everything she saw in this part of the vision, but here, around the food, the children were not playing and not moving much. She said she saw small children sitting near their parents at these street stalls, not asking for things the way small children normally do, not pulling at sleeves or pointing at things they wanted, just sitting. She said that was the word she kept coming back to when she described the children in this part of the vision. Sitting. Still. Like the energy for anything more had already been used up. She said she was then shown something that she found harder to talk about than the wars or the earthquakes. She said she was brought to a place that was more open, outside, like a large flat area that might have been a park or a field. And she saw families there, sitting on the ground in groups, not camping, not resting after a walk, just there, because they had nowhere else to be. And she said she walked among these groups, and what she saw in the faces and the bodies of the people was hunger that had gone on for a long time. She said she saw adults whose clothing hung off them because the bodies inside had become smaller than the clothing was made for. She said she saw people whose cheekbones were very visible, whose hands were thin in a way that made you aware of the bones inside. She said she saw people who moved slowly and carefully, the way you move when you don't have the energy to spend on fast movement. She said she saw a man try to stand up from where he was sitting on the ground and need 2 attempts to do it, his arms shaking as he pushed himself up, and once he was up, he stood still for a moment with his eyes closed, steadying himself. And then she talked about the children again. She said the children were the hardest part of this section of the vision, and she had to stop several times while she was telling me, not from weakness, but because the weight of what she was describing kept settling on her as she said it. She said she saw children who were very young, who should have been the way young children are, round-cheeked and restless and loud, and they were not. She said their faces were thin. She said their arms and legs were thin in a way that showed what was under the skin too clearly. She said some of them were lying down, not asleep, just lying, their eyes open and looking at the sky or at nothing, their chests rising and falling in slow, shallow breaths. She said she saw a mother with 2 children. The mother was sitting on the ground with 1 child in her lap, a very young one, maybe 2 years old, and the older child sitting beside her, maybe 5 or 6. She said the mother had a small amount of food, something soft in a small container, and she was feeding the younger child from it with a spoon, very small amounts, 1 small spoon at a time, and the child was taking it slowly, without the eagerness that a hungry child normally shows around food. The older child was watching the younger one being fed. The mother looked at the older child and then looked at the container, and she looked back at the older child, and she moved the container toward the older one and offered the spoon, and the older child shook their head and looked away. She said she stood there and watched that and could not move for a while. She said she understood what she had just seen. A child old enough to understand the situation had chosen to say no so that the younger child could have more. She said she had never seen anything like it in her life, and she hoped she never would again. But she also knew that she would carry that image with her, always. She said she saw the mothers in that place more than anyone else because the mothers were the ones who were still moving. The men and the older children and the grandparents were sitting or lying, but the mothers were still on their feet, still going from one group to another, checking on people. sharing the small amounts they had, holding small ones, wiping faces. She said she saw a woman who was clearly exhausted, who was clearly running on nothing, still moving through that field, taking care of everyone around her. She said she followed that woman for a little while, and she watched her, and she thought about how strong a person has to be to keep giving when they have nothing left. She said the woman eventually stopped at the edge of the field and looked out at the dry land beyond it. She stood there with her back to the group for a minute. She said the woman's shoulders were shaking slightly. She said the woman reached up and pressed the back of her hand to her eyes for a moment, and then she straightened and turned around and walked back into the group of people and kept going. My daughter stopped speaking for a full minute when she finished describing that woman. She just looked at the ceiling of her hospital room and breathed, and I held her hand and I waited because I could see she was not done. Then she described what happened to the sky. She said the change in the sky did not happen all at once. It started at the edges, the way a stain spreads through fabric when it gets wet. She said the blue of the sky, already pale and washed out in the dry, hungry place she had been, began to darken, but it did not darken the way the sky darkens before rain. There were no clouds gathering. The sky just changed color slowly, the way the color of a bruise changes as it develops, from pale blue to a deeper gray. And then the gray took on a red quality, and then the red deepened and spread, moving from the edges toward the center until the whole sky above her was a dark, heavy red. She said the red was not bright. It was not the red of sunset, which can be beautiful. She said this was a darker, older red, the red of something that had been wrong for a long time. She said it sat on the world the way a lid sits on a pot, pressing down, blocking the light that should have been coming through, letting only a dim, reddish light pass that made everything below it look strange and unwell. She said animals responded to the sky change. She said she saw birds, the few birds that had been moving in that landscape, land and go still. She said she saw the thin dogs she had noticed earlier sit down and look up. She said even the people in the field looked up when the sky changed. She said people who had been lying down and barely moving sat up to look at it. She said nobody spoke. They all just looked up together at this sky that was the wrong color. And she said the silence in that moment was absolute, the most complete silence she had experienced in the whole vision. Then the fog came in. She said it came from all directions at once, low to the ground, moving slowly but with purpose. She said it was not a thin fog. It was thick and heavy and moved in layers, the bottom layer barely off the ground, the higher layers reaching up to maybe the height of a person. She said as it came in, the visibility dropped fast. She said she watched a group of people 20 feet away become hard to see, then harder, then just shapes, then nothing. She said the fog had a weight to it that she could feel, like something pressing in from all sides. She said she tried to walk forward through it and found it difficult, not because the fog stopped her physically, but because in the fog she could not tell where she was going. She could see only a few feet ahead. She said she could still hear the people around her, muffled voices, a child saying something, someone coughing, but she could not see them. She said the fog and the red sky together made a kind of darkness that was not full night, but was not day either. Something in between that felt deeply wrong. She said she stood still in the fog and waited. She said she had the feeling in that stillness that everything was waiting, that the whole world she had been shown, all of it together, the wars and the broken earth and the hunger and the dry rivers, and now this fog under this red sky was all in a state of waiting, like a held breath, like the moment before something very large happens and everything knows it is coming. And then she heard the voice. She stopped talking and looked at me and said, "Mom, I don't know how to explain what this voice was. I don't think there are words for it, but I'm going to try." She said it was not a loud voice. That was the first thing she wanted me to understand. It didn't boom. It didn't fill the sky like thunder. It was firm and clear, and it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. And she said, even though it was not loud, she heard it with more clarity than she had ever heard anything in her life. Like every other sound in the world went silent the moment it spoke. Not because it told them to, but because they knew to. She said the voice spoke in a language she could understand, though she couldn't explain how that was possible. She said the understanding just came with the sound of the voice, like the meaning arrived before the words even finished. And the voice said, "Only those who obey my instructions will be protected in 2026. She said a chill moved through her when she heard those words. Not a chill from cold, but the kind of chill that comes from understanding something very important very suddenly. She said her whole body responded to those words before her mind could even process them. Like something in her recognized the weight of what had just been said. She said after the voice spoke. Everything she had been shown began to replay in her mind all at once, faster and compressed, like a reminder. The soldiers, the fires, the cracked earth, the hungry children, the dry riverbeds, the red sky, the heavy fog. She saw it all again, but quickly, like the vision was making sure she would not forget. And then she was back in her body. The pain returned, the machines were screaming, the nurses were running, and she was back. She looked at me and said, "I know how this sounds." I told her it didn't matter how it sounded. I told her I believed her. And I do. I believe her completely. Not just because she is my daughter. I believe her because of the look on her face when she was telling me. I have known this girl for 23 years. I know her face in all its states. And what I saw on her face as she told me this story was not performance. It was not confusion for medication. It was the face of someone carrying something real and trying to find a way to put it down without breaking it. After she finished talking, we sat together in that hospital room for a long time without speaking. The machines beeped their slow, steady beep. Outside the window it was dark, and I held my daughter's hand and I thought about everything she had said. In the days that followed, she told the story again, to her father, to her older brother. Each time the details were exactly the same. Not almost the same, exactly the same. When you tell a dream, it shifts. Details change. Things are added or removed. But every time Ekvis Wilson told this story, every single time, the words were the same. The sequence was the same. The description of the voice was the same. Her brother, who is a skeptical person by nature, and who has spent his whole life looking for logical explanations for things, sat very quietly for a long time after she finished. He didn't argue with her. He didn't try to explain it away. He just sat there. Our family is not the same as it was before this happened. Something has settled into all of us. A seriousness, a heightened attention to things. We ask each other more questions now. We talk more. We sit together at the dinner table and we actually look at each other. We are less quick to be irritated about small things. We are more gentle with each other than we used to be. I have been thinking about the voice's words ever since. Only those who obey my instructions will be protected. I have turned those words over and over in my mind. And I keep coming back to the same questions. What are the instructions? Where do you find them? How do you know when you are following them correctly? I don't have simple answers. But I have been paying attention in a different way than I used to. I've been paying attention to how I treat people, to whether my words help or hurt, to whether I am honest when it would be easier to be dishonest, to whether I show up for the people in my life or find reasons not to. These things that we all know we should do but find easy to skip. I find them harder to skip now. I think about all those images my daughter described. The people running, the mothers with nothing left to give, the man standing in front of the empty shelf, the child who shook their head so the younger one could eat. I think about them as real people, not as images in a story. Real people with names and histories and things they love. And I think about how fast things can change, how the water in your tap and the food in your refrigerator and the roof over your head are things that can become precious or unavailable more suddenly than any of us want to believe. My daughter has been home for a few months now. She is still sick. Her illness has not gone away. But she is different. Quieter in a thoughtful way, not a sad way. She spends more time sitting by the window in the morning, just looking outside. She draws more. She started writing, which is something she hadn't done since she was a teenager. She told me recently that she feels like she has been given something, not just a warning, but a purpose. Like she was sent back not only to survive, but to tell. And so I am writing this down, because I think that is what you do when someone you love tells you something important. You write it down, you carry it forward, You put it somewhere where it can be found. I am not a person who usually talks about things like near-death experiences or visions. I grew up being told to be practical, to focus on what was in front of you, but I also think that there are things that happen to people that cannot be fully explained by the tools we have been given. Things that land in the body before they land in the mind. Things that leave a mark that doesn't fade. If you are a person who believes in something bigger than yourself, then I hope this story encourages you to listen to whatever that something is asking of you. If you are a person who doesn't believe in anything beyond what you can see and touch, then I hope this story at least encourages you to look at the world around you with more care. Because whether the warnings my daughter received are spiritual or symbolic or something else entirely, the world she described is not a world that is hard to imagine. The wars, the hunger, the drought, the displacement, these are not fantasy. These are things happening right now in different places to different degrees. My daughter is a warrior. She always has been. But she is a different kind of warrior now, not just fighting for her own life, but fighting to make sure that what she saw and what she heard and what she felt in that place between living and not living reaches the people who need to hear it. She asked me to write this down. She said, "Mom, I can't reach everyone, but you write in a way that people listen to. Please write it down." So I did. I wrote it down for her. I wrote it down for the woman kneeling in that open field with nothing left. I wrote it down for the child who shook their head. I wrote it down for every parent who has ever sat in a hospital room and been told to prepare themselves, and for every child who has had to fight for their own life before they were old enough to understand why. I wrote it down because the voice said that there would be those who are protected. And I want everyone who reads this to be one of them. I don't know exactly what the instructions are, but I believe, with every part of me, that it begins with paying attention, with slowing down, with choosing kindness when cruelty would be easier, with being honest when a lie would be more comfortable, with loving the people in front of you before they are gone and it is too late. My daughter almost died. She came back with something she could not have invented and would not have chosen. And every day since then, she gets up and she tries. She tries to be good. She tries to be grateful. She tries to be present. She tries to be the kind of person who, if a voice like that spoke to her again, would not have to wonder whether she had been listening. I am trying to. I am not always successful. I forget. I get tired. I get impatient. I fall back into old habits. But I try. And I think that trying, really trying, is what we are being asked to do. The year she saw is already here. 2026 is not something coming in the distance anymore. It is now. It is the air we are currently breathing. And if you are reading this, then you are still here. You still have time to pay attention. You still have time to make choices that matter. My daughter is sitting by her window right now, probably watching the morning come in. There is a small notebook open on her knee. She is writing, and I am writing too. Because that is what we can do. That is what we are left with. That is the instruction we know how to follow. We tell the truth. We love the people we were given. We pay attention to the world and the people in it, and we do not waste the time we have been given, because we know better than most that time is not something you can count on having more of. That is my daughter's story. That is our story. And now, if you have read this far, it is a little bit yours too.